Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to do a deep dive into, it's a pretty dense document. It's called Nation Under Blackmail. And we're just looking at volume 1 today. So it's all about, like, the hidden history of intelligence agencies, organized crime, people in positions of power.
Yeah. Lots of connections that are maybe not immediately apparent. We're going to try to tease out some of those threads.
Yeah. Give everybody a little roadmap to help navigate this very complex world.
Exactly.
So to start off, I guess, intelligence agencies, obviously they've been around for a while, but in the early days, I mean, what was the relationship between, like, British intelligence and the FBI, like, before the U.S. entered World War II?
Yeah. So, before the U.S. formally entered the war, British intelligence, they had this thing called the BSC, the British Security Coordination. Okay. And it was run by a guy named William Stevenson. He was pretty tight with J. Edgar Hoover.
The FBI guy.
Yeah, Hoover. And they were exchanging a lot of information.
Like what kind of information?
So, there were reports that, the BSC, they allegedly gave the FBI over 100,000 confidential reports.
Wow.
And then in return, Hoover, he kept them informed about, American intelligence stuff. Like the movements of German naval forces, things like that.
So, I mean, there was a lot of, like, cooperation going on early on.
Yeah, absolutely. Like a lot of trust between these, like, new intelligence agencies. You know what I mean?
But that obviously didn't last. I mean, we all know that Hoover and, like, the FBI, they kind of had their own way of doing things.
Right.
So when did that relationship start to break down?
Well, it seems like by 1941, things were starting to get pretty strained between Hoover and Stevenson.
Okay.
And that's when a new player enters the picture, William Donovan.
Okay.
And he's the guy who would go on to start the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services.
Right.
And it seems like he was challenging Hoover's role as, like, the main guy between American and British intelligence.
I see. So it was almost like a power struggle.
Exactly. It was a total bureaucratic power struggle.
Okay.
Roosevelt appoints Donovan, as the coordinator of information.
Okay.
And eventually that led to the creation of the OSS.
Right.
And Hoover, he did not like that. He felt like, Donovan was stepping on his turf.
Right.
Like threatening his power base.
Yeah.
And this whole fight between them, it had some pretty big consequences down the line.
So this is where it gets kind of wild. The book, it suggests that this conflict between Hoover and Donovan, it got so intense that Donovan, he went to some pretty extreme lengths to try to, like, gain leverage over Hoover.
Right.
And they claim that he actually collaborated with Meyer Lansky.
Whoa.
To blackmail Hoover.
Yeah, that's a pretty huge claim.
I mean, how credible is that?
I mean, it's hard to say for sure. But it does, like, really point to just how far people were willing to go in these, like, intelligence power struggles.
Right.
I mean, think about it. You have the future head of American intelligence.
Right.
Potentially working with organized crime to take down another powerful figure.
Right.
I mean, that shows you, like, the lines were really blurred.
Right. Yeah.
Oh.
I mean, it was a different time. Okay, so let's move on. The book spends a lot of time talking about, the opium trade and how it was connected to, like, all these international power dynamics.
Yeah, the opium trade is a big part of this whole story.
Right. So, for example, the Green Gang in China.
Yeah.
They had a stranglehold on the opium trade there.
Right.
And it wasn't just tolerated by Chiang Kai-shek and the KMT.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they actively sanctioned it.
Yeah, they basically partnered up with the Green Gang.
Right.
To control the entire opium market.
So was that, like, a big change from how things were done before?
Yeah, definitely. Like, before the KMT came into power, opium production was more, like, decentralized. It was controlled by all these different factions.
Right.
But under Chiang, they had this supposed campaign against opium.
Okay.
But in reality, it was all about consolidating control.
Right.
Creating this KMT Green Gang monopoly.
Right.
Overproduction, distribution, the whole thing.
And obviously, I mean, they were making a ton of money off of it.
Huge profits.
Right.
Absolutely.
And this move toward, like, centralized control of the opium trade.
Yeah.
It happened at the same time that, international organizations were trying to regulate the global drug trade.
Right.
And there were some pretty big names involved in that, like the Rockefellers, for example.
Yeah.
Through the League of Nations. And their goal seems to have been to like rationalize production and consolidate the refining and distribution of drugs, within these major pharmaceutical corporations.
Yeah, it was almost like a corporate takeover of the drug market.
It was.
Yeah.
In a way.
So, I mean, were there like genuine humanitarian concerns behind all this, or was it purely economic?
Well, I mean, there were probably humanitarian concerns,
right.
But, the League of Nations and the Rockefeller Foundation's International Health Board,
yeah,
they were definitely looking to bring some order to the global drug trade.
Okay.
They wanted to like streamline the production of raw materials like opium and other stuff.
Right.
And then funnel the refining and distribution through these big pharmaceutical companies.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, it wasn't just a moral crusade. It was definitely economic too.
So there was money to be made.
Oh yeah.
Okay. And then there's this guy, Hans Dirks, and he goes even further. He suggests that, there was Anglo-American complicity in this whole KMT Green Gang opium operation.
Right.
And he specifically names the Sassoon family.
The Rothschilds of the East?
Yeah, right.
And they were allegedly responsible for shipping a huge amount of opium into China.
That's right.
So, I mean, this completely changes how we think about the opium trade.
Yeah.
Because it implies that Western powers, I mean, they weren't just condemning it. Right. They were profiting from it.
Yeah, it seems like their financial interests may have been more important than, their moral objections.
Yeah. And this brings us to, you mentioned the CIA earlier.
Right.
And their first proprietary airline, which was a...
CCAT. Civil Air Transport.
CCAT. Okay.
And it's interesting, right? Because CAT actually came out of the Flying Tigers.
The Flying Tigers.
Yeah, it was Claire Chennault's volunteer air unit.
Okay.
That supported the KMT during World War II.
Okay.
And Chennault himself, he was tight with Chiang Kai-shek and TV Soong, who was his brother-in-law.
Yeah.
So you can kind of see how it all ties together.
So it's like this continuation of American involvement in the region. But now it's more covert.
Right.
Right. And we were talking about CT earlier.
Yeah.
The CIA airline. And how it was like this direct link to the Flying Tigers.
Right.
Who were supporting the KMT.
Yeah.
And you had like Chennault.
Right.
Who was close with Chiang Kai-shek and Soong.
Yeah.
So it's like all these pieces start fitting together.
Yeah, you can see how the U.S. was really building their influence in Southeast Asia.
Right. Yeah.
Laying the groundwork for future operations.
Okay. So moving on from like the intelligence world.
Yeah.
Let's talk about some of the financial institutions that are mentioned in the book.
Okay.
So there's Abram Pritzker.
Yeah, Pritzker. Big name.
Right. And he was involved in all sorts of ventures. Like he had the Franklin Investment Company.
Right.
And he partnered with guys like Paul Zifrin and Arthur Green, who was described as the brains of all the Chicago rackets.
Yeah.
And he was allegedly helping Meyer Lansky with his investments.
Right.
And he also had a connection to Jules Stein's Music Corporation of America, or MCA.
Right, MCA. Huge in the entertainment industry.
Yeah. So it's like you start to see how organized crime is.
Yeah.
Like infiltrating these legitimate businesses.
Exactly. And it's not like a hostile takeover or anything. It's more subtle. Like
right.
They're using these intermediaries, guys like Green,
right.
to bridge the gap between the underworld and the legitimate world.
Right.
They can move money around, make investments.
Yeah.
It's all very, very carefully done.
Okay. And then there's another interesting financial link. Burton Cantor and Castle Bank and Trust in the Bahamas.
Oh, yeah. Castle Bank.
And Cantor, he initially said that he was just a tax consultant.
Right.
But he was actually a top manager at the bank.
Yeah.
And he was channeling funds from clients, including like the Pritzker family.
Right.
Into this bank.
Right.
And they had other notable clients too, like Stanford Clinton, Tony Curtis, and even Hugh Hefner.
Hefner. Wow.
He was apparently planning to build a casino with the Pritzkers in Atlantic City.
That's interesting.
Yeah. So it seems like Castle Bank was like this haven for all sorts of people,
right.
Wanting to hide their money.
Yeah, it was a classic offshore bank, designed to like move wealth around.
Okay.
And a lot of the time that wealth had, questionable origins. So you have the Pritzkers, you have celebrities, you have business people,
Right.
all using this bank. And Hefner's involvement is like really telling, right? Because it shows the link between like the legitimate world and these offshore havens.
Right. So they were all like dodging taxes, essentially.
Yeah, that seems to have been a big part of it.
Okay. But I mean, the IRS, they were investigating Castle Bank.
Yeah.
And they uncovered this whole tax evasion network.
Right.
And then the Justice Department, they got involved.
Right.
But then all of a sudden in 1977, they dropped the investigation.
Just like that. Yeah.
That's suspicious.
Very. And then later in 1980, it came out that, somebody had obstructed the investigation.
Wow.
So, I mean, who had that kind of power?
I mean, that's the big question, right? Who could shut down investigations by the IRS and the Justice Department? You know? I mean, it must have been someone with serious connections.
Yeah. It's someone who didn't want people looking too closely at Castle Bank.
Right.
Okay. So the book also talks about this company called International Coin and Land Reserves.
ICLR.
ICLR, yeah.
Yeah.
And it was structured by Burton Cantor and his associates.
Right.
And it turned out to be this massive land fraud scheme, like defrauding people out of millions of dollars.
Yeah, ICLR is a great example of how these like complex financial schemes can be used to defraud people.
Right.
And Cantor, he was right in the middle of it.
Right.
Setting it up, financing it,
right.
Dealing with the banking. So it really makes you wonder where all that money went. Right. Because they never really figured that out, did they?
No, it's still a mystery.
Okay. So let's move on to the Bronfman family.
Okay.
They made a lot of money during Canadian Prohibition.
Right.
They were really good at exploiting loopholes in the liquor laws.
Yeah.
And making a killing off of bootlegging.
Right.
And there's this quote by Keter Newman.
Okay.
That suggests that these loopholes might have been deliberately created to benefit them.
That's interesting.
So it's like they had people on the inside helping them out.
It wouldn't be surprising, would it?
Right. I mean, that's quite an accusation.
Yeah, it is. But it speaks to the level of influence that the Bronfmans had.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, they were able to navigate these complex liquor regulations.
Right.
And build a huge fortune.
Yeah. And later on, Meyer Lansky, he was apparently pretty bitter about how the Bronfmans had managed to clean up their image.
Right.
They became these pillars of society.
Right.
While he was still seen as like a gangster.
Yeah, the respectable businessman versus the mobster.
Right.
It's classic.
Yeah. And Lansky pointed out that he actually had dealings with both the Bronfmans and the Rosensteels back in the 1920s. But they didn't really like to talk about that.
Yeah, I bet they didn't.
So it's like they had this shared history.
Right.
That they were trying to keep quiet.
It definitely makes you wonder what else they might have been involved in.
Yeah. And the book also mentions how, like, early biographers of the Bronfmans, they had a really hard time.
Right.
Especially when Sam Bronfman was still alive. Like, there was this guy, Terrence Robertson, who was trying to write a biography.
Okay.
But his investigation in New York, like, it just stopped out of the blue.
So it seems like they were trying to control their narrative.
Yeah.
Keep certain parts of their past hidden.
Right.
Which, again, just makes you wonder what they were hiding.
Okay. So let's talk about blackmail, because the book gets into some pretty dark territory there.
Yeah, blackmail's a powerful tool.
It is.
Yeah.
And there's this account of a party involving Roy Cohn.
Okay.
J. Edgar Hoover, right, and some young men. And it's described by a friend of the Rosensteels. And it definitely suggests that there might have been something going on there that could have been used for blackmail.
Right.
And Cohn himself, he later made some pretty suggestive comments about Hoover allegedly cross-dressing.
Right.
So it's like he knew something about Hoover.
Yeah, it definitely seems like he knew some dirt.
Yeah.
Which, if you remember the allegations about Donovan and Lansky blackmailing Hoover, it all starts to connect.
Right. So this is a pattern.
It seems like it.
Okay. Then we get into some stuff about Israel.
Okay.
And the book mentions that Sam Bronfman was allegedly involved in a secret purchase of weapons for the Haganah before Israel was even a country.
Right.
They don't give a lot of details.
Yeah.
But it's an interesting tidbit.
Yeah, it suggests that that Bronfman was involved in supporting the creation of Israel from the very beginning, even before it was officially established.
And then there's more concrete information about a later arms deal in 1951.
Okay.
And this time it was for the IDF.
The Israeli Defense Forces.
Yeah. And Bronfman played a big role in that one.
Yeah.
Like Shimon Peres personally asked him to help.
Wow.
And Bronfman, he negotiated the transfer of the weapons.
Yeah.
And he raised the money to pay for them.
So he was really committed to this.
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't just like a symbolic gesture.
Right.
He was putting his money and his connections on the line.
Yeah, he was making a serious contribution to the Israeli military.
Okay. And just to remind everybody, the Haganah, they were like the Zionist paramilitary group that, really made the creation of Israel possible.
Right.
And they got training and weapons from the British military.
Right.
They even worked with guys like Major General Ordie Charles Wingate.
Yeah.
So, I mean, it makes sense that they needed to make these secret purchases.
Yeah, I mean, they were fighting for their survival. They needed all the help they could get.
Okay. Let's get back to finance. So, there was this bank called the International Credit Bank, or ICB.
Okay.
And it was run by a guy named Sylvain Ferdman.
No.
Who was allegedly linked to a skimming racket.
A skimming racket.
Yeah. And the U.S. authorities were trying to, track him down.
So another shady bank.
It seems like it.
What's skimming?
Skimming is where they basically take a little bit of money from a lot of different transactions.
Okay.
So it's hard to detect.
Right. It's like under the radar theft. Makes sense.
And what's interesting about ICB is that some of Meyer Lansky's close associates were on the board of directors.
Oh, really? Like who?
Yeah, like Ed Levinson.
Okay.
He was Lansky's partner in a bunch of Las Vegas casinos.
Right.
And then there was John Pullman.
Pullman, okay.
And Levinson, he was also connected to Clifford Jones.
Jones.
Who was the lieutenant governor of Nevada.
Right.
And Jones was also rumored to have mob ties.
So it's like organized crime is getting their hooks into these banks.
Yeah. It's not just that they're using them to launder money. It's like they're actually influencing how they operate.
Yeah, they're becoming part of the system.
Okay. Then you have the rise of Intrabank.
Intrabank, okay.
Which was run by Yusuf Baydis. And it grew incredibly fast.
How fast?
Like they were making deals with major American banks.
Like
Bank of America and Chase Manhattan.
Wow.
And they were opening branches in all these hop spots for moving dirty money.
Like where?
Places like, well, the book doesn't get specific.
Okay.
But it's implied that it was,
tax havens.
Yeah, tax havens and
places with loose regulations.
Right. And the book says that Intrabank had deep connections to all sorts of illegal financial activities.
So it was a bank for criminals, basically.
Pretty much. But here's the weird part. The founder of Intrabank, Baydis.
Yeah.
He had actually fled the Haganah.
The Haganah. But the bank was allegedly financing the PLO.
Yeah.
That doesn't make sense.
I know. And there were also Zionist-aligned figures involved with the bank.
So it's like they were playing both sides.
It seems like it.
I mean, I guess money talks.
Yeah. And I guess in the Middle East, things are never as straightforward as they seem.
Right. There's always something going on behind the scenes.
Okay. Now let's talk about a guy named Bruce Rappaport.
Okay.
He was a bit of a shadowy figure.
Okay.
It's possible that he was introduced to Semyon Mogilevich by Robert Maxwell.
Mogilevich. That's a big name.
Right. And he was also acquainted with Edmund Safra.
Oh, okay. So we're talking about some serious financial players here.
Yeah. These guys were involved in some pretty big deals.
Yeah.
Globally.
Right.
And it wasn't always clear what they were up to.
Right. They operated in the shadows.
Yeah.
Okay. So what about this Rappaport guy? What's his story?
Well, he was born in Haifa.
Okay.
Got a law degree.
Okay.
Served as a judge in Israel. And was a major in the IDF.
So he's got legal, judicial, and military experience.
Yeah.
Interesting combination.
Yeah. And he might have had some intelligence connections, too.
Right. You don't get to be a major in the IDF without knowing some people.
Right. So it's not surprising that he ended up involved in
some shady financial dealings.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about Israel, the U.S. What about Canada? Are they in this mix?
Oh, yeah. Canada's in there, too.
How so?
So there's this guy named Louis Mortimer Bloomfield.
Okay.
And he was the honorary consul to Liberia.
Okay.
And he had these powerful connections through this law firm.
What law firm?
Phillips and Weinberg.
Yeah.
In Montreal.
Okay.
And they were linked to the Royal Bank of Canada.
Okay. So a big Canadian bank.
Yeah. And they were involved in bringing foreign capital into Canada.
So Canada was a conduit for international finance.
Yeah, exactly. They played a bigger role than people think.
Right. It's not all about the U.S.
Right. Okay, we got to talk about Roy Cohn again.
Oh, Cohn, yeah. Can't forget about him.
Because he's just like this central figure.
Or he's the master manipulator.
Yeah. I mean, they describe him as New York City's preeminent manipulator.
Right.
And, he had this massive network.
Yeah.
And he was allegedly using blackmail to get what he wanted.
Right.
Just like J. Edgar Hoover.
Like birds of a feather.
Yeah. And, even after he died, a big chunk of his FBI file was still censored.
Wow.
So it must have been some pretty explosive stuff.
Yeah, I bet it was.
Okay. So the book also talks about Albert Cohn, who was Roy Cohn's father.
Okay.
And his marriage to Dora Marcus, who was the daughter of a very wealthy banking family.
Right.
And it's presented as this, like, strategic move.
Okay.
Like a way for Albert to get ahead politically and financially.
Right. It was a marriage of convenience.
Yeah. And then you have, at the time, the National Crime Syndicate had a lot of influence over New York politicians.
Right.
And Meyer Lansky was even donating to Al Smith's campaigns.
Oh, Smith.
Yeah.
Wow. So organized crime was right there in the mix?
Yeah. They were bankrolling politicians.
It's crazy how much influence they had.
Yeah. And then there's this whole thing about the Buchalter case.
Buchalter, okay.
Where there are these two star prosecutors, Thomas Dewey and William O'Dwyer.
Okay.
And they both had connections to the same criminal syndicate that they were prosecuting.
So they were going after criminals while being connected to them.
Yeah. That's pretty wild.
What about O'Dwyer? He was known for being tough on corruption, wasn't he?
He was. But then they had this investigation into Harry Gross's gambling empire.
Okay.
And it turned out that Gross was paying off people connected to O'Dwyer.
So even the guy who was supposed to be cleaning up the city was dirty?
It seems like it.
That's messed up.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've got corrupt politicians, crooked law enforcement. What about the banks?
Oh, yeah. The banks are definitely part of this story.
Okay, lay it on me.
So Albert Cohn's father,